What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about horror movies of the 1980s? Is it a mysterious masked killer terrorizing teens in the woods? Or maybe a possessed evil child? Maybe the final girl running away with a broken ankle? These are more than just scenes from these movies. These are classic tropes, and since the 1980s, these tropes have been evolving, reflecting not only our fears, but the changing culture. For this video, I would like to explore the growth and evolution of these tropes and how horror movies have used and reinvented the tropes since the 1980s. The 1980s was the golden age for the slasher genre when horror had been distilled down to a familiar formula of trapped teens and a killer with seemingly supernatural powers and the body count as high as possible. The most defined piece of this age of film was the final girl cliche, where the lone girl survivor must battle the killer or be the only one to escape. As Van Robert explains in Pop Culture Universe, the slasher formula held firm in the 1980s, where the killer or creature kills a group of individuals, typically teenagers, and leaves a single survivor, typically female, to fight the killer in a climactic confrontation. These movies were more than just about the gore, however. They were about the social fears. The 1980s were a time when fears about youth, sexuality, and suburban safety were mounted. Victims were typically punished for a sinful behavior, pushing a sort of cinematic moral code onto the viewers. Then, in the 90s, horror evolved and got smarter and more self-aware. The genre started using meta-commentary on itself, making comments and tropes in films, playing with viewers' expectations. The best example of this is Scream, directed by Wes Craven. This film uses many homages to older slashers to tell a new story in a unique way, drawing viewers in a way that they haven't been before. In film, media, in history, and teaching and learning, Marcus and Paxson observe, quote, "The 1990s introduced horror that was more self-referential, playing off the audience's familiarity with the slasher formulas," end quote. But this era wasn't just clever, it was psychological. Films like The Sixth Sense and The Blair Witch Project shifted away from mass killers towards internal and existential fears. The mockumentary style of Blair Witch in particular ushered in a new era of found footage horror where reality blurred with fiction, pulling the viewer directly into the terror. This film was the first to utilize online marketing, making real missing person web pages for the movie's main trio along with uploading side content to flesh out the world and lore of the movie, tricking many early viewers to believing it was real. This trend kept up into the early 2000s, bringing us into a new age of horror with some real-world tragedies slightly responsible. After 9/11, horror responded to a world changed by fear and trauma, entering the age of torture porn. Films like Saw and Hostel, where survival came at a brutal cost. Jennifer Selway in The Making of Horror Movie writes, quote, "The horror genre after 9/11 leaned into violence that felt raw and real, not unlike the relentless images seen in media coverage of the attacks and wars," end quote. This era also revived zombies, not as campy monsters, but as metaphors for societal collapse and biological fear. Films like 28 Days Later and Dawn of the Dead updated the undead world for a world worried about pandemics, terrorism, and systemic failure. The trope of the hopeless ending also became more common. The heroes didn't always win, sometimes there was just no escape. A good example of this style of ending is Drag Me to Hell by Sam Raimi, with the ending having the main character complete her goal only to still have her soul dragged to hell. The 2010s also introduced a new wave, prestige horror. Films that critics finally took seriously, directors like Jordan Peele with Get Out, Ari Aster with Hereditary and Midsommar, and Robert Eggers with The Witch, elevated horror into the art house territory. These films returned to symbolism and cultural commentary, blending tropes with real-world themes like race, grief, religion, and trauma. Catherine LaFont writes in Pop Culture Universe, quote, "Popular culture in the 21st century increasingly became a space where political and cultural tensions were explored through genre, horror being one of the most powerful for this," end quote. For example, Get Out uses the trope of the outsider in danger, but recontextualizes it in the lens of racial microaggressions and exploitation. It's more than just a haunted house, it's a social critique. The horror trope of the monster within returned, but this time it wasn't just about mental illness or possession. It was about generational trauma, systemic violence, and identity. Today, horror is more accessible than ever thanks to streaming platforms like Netflix, Shudder, and Hulu. This has allowed global horror to reach mainstream audiences, bringing new cultural tropes to the forefront. The 2020s also highlight the trope of digital horror. Stories told through screens like Host in 2020, filmed entirely over Zoom, or Unfriended. Technology isn't just a tool, it's the trap. In the Chambers Film Fact Finder, the entry on horror notes, quote, "The genre continually reinvents itself with societal change, remaining relevant through its capacity to adapt tropes to new fears, from radiation to AI," end quote. What remains consistent? The core themes of isolation, fear of the unknown, and the inescapable consequences of human action. Even smaller genres like found footage are evolving. Look at a movie like Skinamarink, which uses surreal minimalism and VHS fuzz to evoke childhood fears with almost no dialogue. It's experimental, unsettling, and wildly effective, bringing you into the world of a child's nightmare. Tropes in the wrong hands can be lazy, but I believe with good directors that they can be used as tools. Tools that today's horror filmmakers can use to guide, mislead, and scare us. Overused, they can become cliche, but subverted, they become powerful and often the most memorable part of a movie experience. As stated in AV A to Z, an encyclopedic dictionary of media, quote, tropes in horror evolve not just as an aesthetic choice, but as a response to what a culture is most afraid of in the moment, end quote. Think about it. Why do we move on from mass killers to invisible trauma, from slashers to social allegory? Because horror is not just about monsters, it's about us. From the final girl in the 1980s to the trauma-ridden mother in Hereditary, to the digitally haunted Zoom calls of the 2020s, horror has always adapted to what keeps us up at night. As Engel Graves put it in Pop Culture Universe, quote, horror films serve as cultural artifacts, revealing the fears, desires, and tensions of the times in which they are made, end quote. So next time you're watching a horror film, don't just look at the jump scares, look at what they're really trying to say. Because in horror, the real monster is never just the killer, ghost, or the demon. It is what we fear when the lights go out and what we see when they come back on.